Chapter 15. There was little furniture in the dining room, but the noble lines and the very size of the place lent grace to the long sideboard and the modest mahogany table where Tristan and I sat at breakfast. The single large window was patterned with frost, and in the street outside the footsteps of the passers-by crunched in the crisp snow. I looked up from my boiled egg as a car drew up. There was a stamping in the porch. The outer door banged shut, and Siegfried burst into the room. Without a word, he made for the fire and hung over it, leaning his elbows on the grey marble mantelpiece. He was muffled almost to the eyes in great coat and scarf, but what you could see of his face was purplish blue. He turned a pair of streaming eyes to the table. A milk fever up at Old Hellstein's, one of the high buildings. God, it was cold up there. I could hardly breathe. As he pulled off his gloves and shook his numbed fingers in front of the flames, he darted sidelong glances at his brother. Tristan's chair was nearest the fire, and he was enjoying his breakfast as he enjoyed everything, slapping the butter happily on to his toast and whistling as he applied the marmalade. His daily mirror was balanced against the coffee pot. He could almost see the waves of comfort and contentment coming from him. Siegfried dragged himself unwillingly from the fire and dropped into a chair. "I'll just have a cup of coffee, James." Hellstein was very kind, and he asked me to sit down and have breakfast with him. He gave me a lovely slice of home-fed bacon, a bit fat maybe, but what a flavor. I can taste it now. He put down his cup with a clatter. "You know, there's no reason why we should have to go to the grocer for our bacon and eggs. There's a perfectly good hen house at the bottom of the garden and a pigsty in the yard with a boiler for the swill. All our household waste could go towards feeding a pig. We'd probably do it quite cheaply." He rounded on Tristan, who had just lit a woodbine and was shaking out his mirror with an air of ineffable pleasure which was peculiar to him. "And it would be a useful job for you. You're not producing much, sitting around here on your arse all day. A bit of stock keeping would do you good." Tristan put down his paper as though the charm had gone out of it. "Stock keeping? Well, I feed your mare as it is." He didn't enjoy looking after Siegfried's new hunter, because every time he turned her out to water in the yard, she would take a playful kick at him in passing. Siegfried jumped up. "I know you do. And it doesn't take all day, does it? It won't kill you to take on the hens and pigs." "Pigs?" Tristan looked startled. "I thought you said pig." "Yes, pigs. I've been thinking, if I buy a litter of wieners, we can sell the others and keep one for ourselves. Won't cost a thing that way." "Not with free labor, certainly." "Labor? Labor? You don't know what it means. Look at you lying back there puffing your head off. You smoke too many of those bloody cigarettes." "So do you." "Never mind me. I'm talking about you," Siegfried shouted. I got up from the table with a sigh. Another day had begun. When Siegfried got an idea, he didn't muck about. Immediate action was his watchword. Within 48 hours, a litter of 10 little pigs had taken up residence in the sty, and 12 little Sussex pullets were pecking about behind the wire of the hen house. He was particularly pleased with the pullets. "Look at them, James. Just on a point of lay, and a very good strain, too. There'll be just a trickle of eggs at first, but once they get cracking, we'll be snowed under. Nothing like a nice fresh egg warm from the nest." It was plain from the first that Tristan didn't share his brother's enthusiasm for the hens. I often found him hanging about outside the hen house, looking bored and occasionally throwing bread crusts over the wire. There was no evidence of the regular feeding, the balanced diet recommended by the experts. As egg producers, the hens had held no appeal for him, but he did become mildly interested in them as personalities. An odd way of clucking, a peculiarity in gait, these things amused him. But there were no eggs, and as the weeks passed, Siegfried became increasingly irritable. Wait till I see the chap that sold me those hens, damned scoundrel. Good laying strain my foot. It was pathetic to see him anxiously exploring the empty nesting boxes every morning. One afternoon, I was going down to the garden when Tristan called to me. Come over here, Jim. There is something new. I bet you've never seen anything like it before. He pointed upwards, and I saw a group of unusually colored large birds perched in the branches of the elms. There were more of them in the neighbors' apple trees. I stared in astonishment. You're right. I've never seen anything like them. What are they? Oh, come on, said Tristan, grinning in delight. Surely there's something familiar about them. Take another look. I peered upwards again. No, I've never seen birds as big as that, and with such exotic plumage. What is that, a freak migration? Tristan gave a shout of laughter. They're our hens. How the devil did they get up there? They've left home, hopped it. I can only see 7. Where are the rest of them? God knows. Let's have a look over the wall. The crumbling mortar gave plenty of toe holds between the bricks, and we looked down into the next garden. The other 5 hens were there, pecking contentedly among some cabbages. It took a long time to get them all back into the hen house, and the tedious business had to be repeated several times a day thereafter. For the hens had grown tired of life under Tristan and decided that they would do better living off the country. They became nomads, ranging ever further afield in their search for sustenance. At first the neighbors chuckled. They phoned to say their children were rounding up the hens and would we come and get them. But with the passage of time, their jocularity wore thin. Finally, Siegfried was involved in some painful interviews. His hens, he was told, were an unmitigated nuisance. It was after one particularly unpleasant session that Siegfried decided that the hens must go. It was a bitter blow, and as usual he vented his fury on Tristan. I must have been mad to think that any hens under your care would ever lay eggs. But really, isn't it just a bit hard? I give you this simple little job, and one would have thought that even you would be hard put to make a mess of it. But look at the situation after only 3 weeks. Not one solitary egg have we seen. The bloody hens are flying about the countryside like pigeons. We are permanently estranged from our neighbors. You've done a thorough job, haven't you? All the frustrated egg producer in Siegfried welled out in his shrill tones. Tristan's expression registered only wounded virtue, but he was rash enough to try to defend himself. You know, I thought there was something queer about those hens from the start, he muttered. Siegfried shred the last vestiges of self-control. Queer? He yelled wildly. You're the one that's queer, not the poor bloody hens. You're the queerest bugger there is. For God's sake, get out of my sight. Tristan withdrew with quiet dignity. It took some time for the last echoes of the poultry venture to die away, but after a fortnight, sitting at the dining table with Tristan, I felt sure that all was forgotten, so that it was with a strange sense of workings of fate that I saw Siegfried stride into the room and lean menacingly over his brother. You remember those hens, I suppose? He said, almost in a whisper. You'll recall that I gave them away to Mrs. Dale, that old aged pensioner down Brown's Yard? Well, I've just been speaking to her. She's delighted with them, gives them a hot mash night and morning, and she's collecting 10 eggs a day. His voice rose almost to a scream. 10 eggs, do you hear? 10 eggs! I hurriedly swallowed the last of my tea and excused myself. I trotted along the passage, out the back door, and up the garden to my car. On the way, I passed the empty henhouse. It had a forlorn look. It was a long way to the dining room, but I could still hear Siegfried. Chapter 16. Jim, come over here and look at these little beggars. Tristan laughed excitedly as he leaned over the door of the pigsty. I walked across the yard. What is it? I've just given them their swill, and it's a bit hot. Just look at them. The little pigs were seizing the food, dropping it, and walking suspiciously around it. They would creep up, touch the hot potatoes with their muzzles, and leap back in alarm. There was none of the usual mealtime slobbering, just a puzzled grunting. Right from the start, Tristan had found the pigs more interesting than the hens, which was a good thing because he had to retrieve himself after the poultry disaster. He spent a lot of time in the yard, sometimes feeding or mucking out, but more often resting his elbows on the door, watching his charges. As with the hens, he was more interested in their characters than their ability to produce pork or bacon. After he poured the swell into the long trough, he always watched, entranced, while the pigs made their first rush. Soon, in the desperate gobbling, there would be signs of uneasiness. The tiny animals would begin to glance sideways until the urge to find out what their mates were enjoying so much had become unbearable. They would start to change position frantically, climbing over each other's backs and falling into the swill. Old Boardman was a willing collaborator, but mainly in an advisory capacity. Like all countrymen, he considered he knew all about the husbandry and diseases of animals, and it turned out pigs were his specialty. There were long conferences in the dark room under the Barnes Father cartoons, and the old man grew animated over his description of the vast, beautiful animals he had reared in that very sty. Tristan listened with respect, because he had solid proof of Boardman's expertise in the way he'd handled the old brick boiler. Tristan could light the thing, but it went out if he turned his back on it. But it was docile in Boardman's hands. I often saw Tristan listening wonderingly to the steady blub blub while the old man rambled on, and the delicious scent of cooking pig potatoes drifted over them both. But no animal converts food more quickly into flesh than a pig, and as the weeks passed, the little pink creatures changed with alarming speed into 10 solid no-nonsense porkers. Their characters deteriorated too. They lost all their charm. Mealtime stopped being fun and became a battle, with the odds growing heavier against Tristan all the time. I could see that it brought a lot of color into old Boardman's life, and he always dropped whatever he was doing when he saw Tristan scooping the swill from the boiler. He obviously enjoyed watching the daily contest with his seat on the stone trough. Tristan bracing himself, listening to the pigs squealing at the rattle of the bucket, giving a few fearsome shouts to encourage himself, then shooting the bolt and plunging among the grunting, jostling animals, broad, greedy snouts forcing themselves into the bucket, sharp feet grinding his toes, heavy bodies thrusting against his legs. I couldn't help smiling when I remembered the light-hearted game it used to be. There was no laughter now. Tristan finally took to brandishing a heavy stick at the pigs before he dared to go in. Once inside, his only hope of staying on his feet was to clear a little space by beating on the backs. It was on market day, when the pigs had almost reached bacon weight, that I came upon Tristan sprawled in his favorite chair. There was something unusual about him. He wasn't asleep. No medicine bottle, no woodbines, no daily mirror. His arms hung limply over the sides of the chair. His eyes were half closed, and sweat glistened on his forehead. "Jim," he whispered, "I've had the most hellish afternoon I've ever had in my life." I was alarmed at his appearance. "What happened?" "The pigs," he croaked. "They escaped today." "Escaped? How the devil could they do that?" Tristan tugged at his hair. "It was when I was feeding the mare. I gave her hay, and I thought I might as well feed the pigs at the same time. You know what they've been like lately. Well, today they went berserk. Soon as I opened the door, they charged out in a solid block, sent me up in the air, bucket and all, and then ran over the top of me." He shuddered and looked up at me wide-eyed. "I tell you this, Jim, when I was lying there on the cobbles, covered with swill, and that lot trampling on me, I thought it was all over. But they didn't savage me. They belted out through the yard door at full gallop." "The yard door was open then?" "Too true it was. I would just choose this one day to leave it open." Tristan sat up and wrung his hands. "Well, you know, I thought it would be all right at first. You see, they slowed down when they got into the lane and trotted quietly around into the front street with Boardman and I hard on their heels. They formed a group there. They didn't seem to know where to go next. I was sure we were going to be able to head them off, but just then one of them caught sight of itself in Robson's shop window. He gave a remarkable impression of a pig staring at its reflection for a few moments, then leaping back with a startled grunt. Well, that did it, Jim. The bloody animal panicked and shot off into the marketplace at about 50 miles an hour, with the rest after it. I gasped. 10 large pigs loose among the packed stalls and market day crowds was difficult even to imagine. "Oh God, you should have seen it." Tristan fell back wearily into his chair. "Women and kids screaming, the stallholders, police, and everybody else cursing me. There was a terrific traffic jam too, miles of cars tooting like hell, while the policeman on point duty concentrated on browbeating me." He wiped his brow. "You know that fast-talking merchant on the china stall? Well, today I saw him at a loss for words. He was balancing a cup on his palm and in full cry when one of the pigs got its 4 feet on his stall and stared him straight in the face. He stopped as if he'd been shot. Any other time it would have been funny, but I thought the perishing animal was going to wreck the stall. The counter was beginning to rock when the pig changed its mind and made off." "What's the position now?" I asked. "Have you got them back?" "I've got 9 of them back," Tristan replied, leaning back and closing his eyes. "With the help of almost the entire male population of the district, I've got 9 of them back. The 10th was last seen heading north at a good pace. God knows where it is now. Oh, I didn't tell you. One of them got into the post office. Spent quite some time in there." He put his hands over his face. "I'm for it this time, Jim. I'll be in the hands of the law after this lot. There's no doubt about it." I leaned over and slapped his leg. "Oh, I shouldn't worry. I don't suppose there's been any serious damage done." Tristan replied with a groan. "But there's something else." When I finally closed the door after getting the pigs back in their sty, I was on the verge of collapse. I was leaning against the wall, gasping for breath, when I saw the mare had gone. Yes, gone. I'd gone straight out after the pigs and forgot to close her box. I don't know where she is. Boardman said he'd look around. I haven't the strength." Tristan lit a trembling woodbine. "This is the end, Jim. Siegfried will have no mercy this time." As he spoke, the door flew open and his brother rushed in. "What the hell is going on?" he roared. "I've just been speaking to the vicar, and he says my mare is in his garden eating his wallflowers. He's hopping mad, and I don't blame him. Go on, you lazy scoundrel. Don't lie there. Get over to the vicarage this instant and bring her back." Tristan did not stir. He lay inert, looking up at his brother. His lips moved feebly. No, he said. What's that? Siegfried shouted incredulously. Get out of that chair immediately. Go and get that mare. No, replied Tristan. I felt a chill of horror. This sort of mutiny was unprecedented. Siegfried had gone very red in the face, and I steeled myself for an interruption. But it was Tristan who spoke. If you want your mare, you can get her yourself. His voice was quiet, with no note of defiance. He had the air of a man to whom the future is of no account. Even Siegfried could see that this was one time when Tristan had had enough. After glaring down at his brother for a few seconds, he turned and walked. He got the mare himself. Nothing more was said about the incident, but the pigs were moved hurriedly to the bacon factory and were never replaced. Its stock-keeping project was at an end. Chapter 17. When I came in, Miss Harbottle was sitting, head bowed, over the empty cash box. She looked bereaved. It was a new, shiny black box with the words Petty Cash printed on top in white letters. Inside was a red book with the incomings and outgoings recorded in neat columns. But there was no money. Miss Harbottle's sturdy shoulders sagged. She listlessly took up the red book between the finger and thumb, and a lonely sixpence rolled from between its pages and tinkled into the box. He's been at it again, she whispered. A stealthy footstep sounded in the passage. Mr. Farnan, she called out, and to me, it's really absurd the way the man always tries to slink past the door. Siegfried shuffled in. He was carrying a stomach tube and a pump, calcium bottles bulged from his pockets, and a bloodless castrator dangled from the other hand. He smiled cheerfully, but I could see he was uncomfortable. Not only because of the load he carried, but because of his poor tactical position. Miss Harbottle had arranged her desk across the corner diagonally opposite the door, and he had to walk along a long stretch of carpet to reach her. From her point of view, it was strategically perfect. From her corner, she could see every inch of the big room, into the passage when the door was open, and out onto the front street, from the window on her left. Nothing escaped her. It was a position of power. Siegfried looked down at the square figure behind the desk. Good morning, Miss Harbottle. Can I do anything for you? The eyes glinted behind the gold-rimmed spectacles. You can indeed, Mr. Farnan. You can explain why you have once more emptied my petty cash box. Oh, I'm so sorry. I had to rush through to Broughton last night, and I found myself a bit short. There was really nowhere else to turn to. But, Mr. Farnan, in the 2 months I have been here, we must have been over this a dozen times. What is the good of my trying to keep an accurate record of the money in the practice if you keep stealing it and spending it? Well, I suppose I got into the habit in the old pint pot days. It wasn't a bad system, really. It wasn't a system at all. It was anarchy. You cannot run a business that way. But I've told you this so many times, and each time you have promised to alter your ways. I feel almost at my wits' end. Oh, never mind, Miss Harbottle. Get some more out of the bank and put it in your box. That'll put it right. Siegfried gathered up the loose coils of the stomach tube from the floor and turned to go. But Miss Harbottle cleared her throat warningly. There are 1 or 2 other matters. Will you please try to keep your other promise to enter your visits in the book every day and to price them as you do so? Nearly a week has gone by since you wrote anything in. How can I possibly get the bills out on the 1st of the month? This is most important, but how do you expect me to do it when you impede me like this? Yes, I'm sorry, but I have a string of calls waiting. I really must go. He was halfway across the floor, and the tube was uncoiling itself again when he heard the ominous throat clearing behind him. And one more thing, Mr. Farnan, I still can't decipher your writing. These medical terms are difficult enough, so please take a little care and don't scribble. Very well, Miss Harbottle. He quickened his pace through the door and into the passage, where, it seemed, was safety and peace. He was clattering thankfully over the tiles when the familiar rumbling reached him. She could project that sound a surprising distance by giving it a bit of extra pressure, and it was a summons which had to be obeyed. I could hear him wearily putting the tube and pump on the floor. The calcium bottles must have been digging into his ribs because I heard them go down too. He presented himself again before the desk. Miss Harbottle wagged a finger at him. While I have you here, I'd like to mention another point which troubles me. Look at this day book. You see all these slips sticking out of the pages? They are all queries. There must be scores of them, and I'm at a standstill until you clear them for me. When I ask you, never have the time. Can you go over them with me now? Siegfried backed away hurriedly. No, not just now. As I said, I have some urgent calls waiting. I'm very sorry, but it will have to be some other time. First chance I get, I'll come in and see you. He felt the door behind him, and with a last glance at the massive, disapproving figure behind the desk, he turned and fled. Chapter 18. I could look back now on 6 months of hard, practical experience. I had treated cows, horses, pigs, dogs, cats 7 days a week, in the morning, afternoon, evening, and through the hours when the world was asleep. I had calved cows and farrowed sows till my arms ached and the skin peeled off. I had been knocked down, trampled on, and sprayed liberally with every kind of muck. I had seen a fair cross-section of the diseases of animals, and yet a little voice had begun to niggle at the back of my mind. It said I knew nothing at all. This was strange, because those 6 months had been built upon 5 years of theory, a slow, painful assimilation of thousands of facts, and a careful storage of fragments of knowledge, like a squirrel with its nuts, beginning with the study of plants and the lowest forms of life, working up to dissection in the anatomy lab and physiology and the vast, soulless territory of materia medica, then pathology, which tore down the curtain of ignorance and let me look for the first time into the deep secrets, and parasitology, the teeming otherworld of the worms and fleas and mage mites. Finally, medicine and surgery, the crystallization of my learning and its application to the everyday troubles of animals. And there were many others, like physics, chemistry, hygiene. They didn't seem to have missed a thing. Why, then, should I feel I knew nothing? Why had I begun to feel like an astronomer looking through a telescope at an unknown galaxy? This sensation that I was only groping about on the fringes of limitless space was depressing. It was a funny thing, because everybody seemed to know all about sick animals. The chap who held the cow's tail, the neighbor from the next farm, men in pubs, jobbing gardeners, they all knew, and were free and confident with their advice. I tried to think back over my life. Was there any time when I had felt this supreme faith in my own knowledge? And then I remembered. I was back in Scotland. I was 17. I was walking under the arch of the veterinary college into Montrose Street. I had been a student for 3 days, but not until this afternoon had I felt the thrill of fulfillment. Messing about with botany and zoology was all right, but this afternoon had been the real thing. I had had my first lecture in animal husbandry. The subject had been the points of the horse. Professor Grant had hung up a life-size picture of a horse and gone over it. from nose to tail, indicating the withers, the stifle, the hock, the pole, and all the other rich equine terms. And the professor had been wise. To make his lecture more interesting, he kept throwing in little practical points like, "This is where we find the curb," or "Here is the site for wind galls." He talked of thoroughpins and side bones, splints and quitter, things the students wouldn't learn about for another 4 years. But it brought it all to life. The words were still spinning in my head as I walked slowly down the sloping street. This was what I had come for. I felt as though I had undergone an initiation and become a member of an exclusive club. I really knew about horses, and I was wearing a brand new riding mac and with all sorts of extra straps and buckles which slapped against my legs as I turned the corner of the hill into busy Newton Road. I could hardly believe my luck when I saw the horse. It was standing outside the library below Queen's Cross, like something left over from another age. It drooped dispiritedly between the shafts of a coal cart, which stood like an island in an eddying stream of cars and buses. Pedestrians hurried by, uncaring, but I had the feeling that fortune was smiling on me. A horse, not just a picture, but a real, genuine horse. Stray words from the lecture floated up into my mind. The pastern, cannon bone, coronet, and all those markings, snip, blaze, white sock near hind. I stood on the pavement and examined the animal critically. I thought it must be obvious to every passer-by that here was a true expert. Not just an inquisitive onlooker, but a man who knew and understood all. I felt clothed in a visible aura of horsiness. I took a few steps up and down, hands deep in the pockets of the new riding mac, eyes probing for possible shoeing faults or curbs or bogs bavins. So thorough was my inspection that I worked round to the off side of the horse and stood perilously among the racing traffic. I glanced around at the people hurrying past. Nobody seemed to care, not even the horse. He was a large one, at least 17 hands, and he gayed apathetically down the street, easing his hind legs alternatively in a bored manner. I hated to leave him, but I had completed my examination, and it was time I was on my way. But I felt I ought to make a gesture before I left, something to communicate to the horse that I understood his problems, and that we belonged to the same brotherhood. I stepped briskly forward and patted him on the neck. Quick as a snake, the horse whipped downward and seized my shoulder in his great, strong teeth. He laid back his ears, rolled his eyes wickedly, and hoisted me up, almost off my feet. I hung there helplessly, suspended like a lopsided puppet. I wriggled and kicked, but the teeth were clamped immovably in the material of my coat. There was no doubt about the interest of the passers-by now. The grotesque sight of a man hanging from a horse's mouth brought them to a sudden halt, and a crowd formed with people looking over each other's shoulders and others fighting at the back to see what's going on. A horrified old lady was crying, "Oh, poor boy, help him, somebody." Some of the braver characters tried pulling at me, but the horse whickered ominously and hung on tighter. Conflicting advice was shouted from all sides. With deep shame, I saw 2 attractive girls in the front row giggling helplessly. Appalled at the absurdity of my position, I began to thrash about wildly. My shirt collar tightened around my throat. A stream of the horse's saliva trickled down the front of my mac. I could feel myself choking and was giving up hope when a man pushed his way through the crowd. He was very small. Angry eyes glared from a face blackened by coal dust. 2 empty sacks were draped over an arm. "What the hell's this?" he shouted. A dozen replies babbled in the air. "Can ye no leave the bloody 'orse alone?" he yelled into my face. I made no reply, being pop-eyed, half-throttled, and in no mood for conversation. The coalman turned his fury on the horse. "Drop him, you big bastard! Go on, let him go!" Let go! Drop him! Getting no response, he dug the animal viciously in the belly with his thumb. The horse took the point at once and released me like an obedient dog dropping a bone. I fell on my knees and ruminated in the gutter for a while till I could breathe more easily. As from a great distance, I could still hear the little man shouting at me. After some time I stood up. The coalman was still shouting, and the crowd was listening appreciatively. "What do you think you're playing at? Get your hands off my bloody horse! Get the police, I tell you!" I looked down at my new Mac. The shoulder was chewed to a sodden mass. I felt I must escape and began to edge my way through the crowd. Some of the faces were concerned, but most were grinning. Once clear, I started to walk away rapidly, and as I turned the corner, the last faint cry from the coalman reached me. "Dinna meddle with things you ken nothing about."